A dim, yellowish light from a single lamp hanging from the low concrete ceiling struggled to penetrate the thick, stale air of the Führer's bedroom. In the early hours of a July day in 1944, deep underground in the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler was already sitting on the edge of his hard, uncomfortable bed. His body, clad in thin silk pajamas, seemed particularly fragile against the massive concrete walls. With effort, he raised his trembling hands, trying to fasten the top button of his uniform jacket, which, contrary to all norms, lay beside him, ready for immediate use. This simple, almost intimate, everyday task proved difficult for him, a stark contrast to the image of the omnipotent and infallible leader that all of Germany knew. Today, we will see what he eats and drinks, how his body reacts to stress and constant medication, and how he interacts with his inner circle amidst the looming military and personal collapse. His face in the dim mirror was deathly pale and gaunt, with deep shadows under his eyes, revealing the chronic insomnia that had become his constant companion. The stoop he tried to hide in public was now evident, as if an invisible weight pressed down on his shoulders, forcing his body to bend. His entire figure, usually so commanding and tense, now seemed like a mere shell, exhausted by years of war and stress. Behind the heavy steel door, which muffled the sounds of the outside world, the cautious footsteps of his valet, Heinz Linge, could already be heard. He waited for a signal to bring fresh newspapers and a glass of water, trying not to make a single unnecessary sound so as not to disturb the Führer. His aides knew that his mood in the morning was particularly volatile, and any careless movement could provoke an outburst of rage. Hitler felt a slight dizziness which had become familiar, and noticed the unpleasant, stale smell of dampness that permeated the bunker's concrete walls, mixed with a faint scent of disinfectant. His right hand, despite his efforts, continued to tremble almost imperceptibly. Beyond the thick bunker walls, thousands of kilometers away, the war he himself had unleashed raged on, a war he now desperately struggled to control. Every day at the Wolf's Lair brought echoes of defeat. News of heavy fighting on the Eastern Front, the rapid Allied landing in Normandy, and growing discontent and even betrayal within the Wehrmacht ranks all weighed heavily on him. It fueled his paranoia and accelerated his physical decline. Yet even in this state, with trembling hands, a hunched back, and perpetual exhaustion, he remained the Führer. His orders still shaped the destinies of millions, even as the world around him rapidly crumbled. Now, in this concrete sarcophagus, he was merely a man whose body was failing. His mind clung to the last vestiges of control, still attempting to dictate his will to an entire continent. This day, seemingly ordinary, would become one of those that led to his end. It would reveal how a man whose name became synonymous with evil lived in the very conditions he himself had created. Valet Heinz Linge finally received a quiet signal. He carefully knocked on the heavy door to the Führer's bedroom, waited for a quiet "come in," and then entered, carrying a tray with the morning newspapers and a glass of water. The smell of iodine and medicine hanging in the air mingled with the scent of fresh printer's ink. Hitler, already fully dressed in his grey uniform, sat on the edge of his bed, his back stooped. The cold floor beneath his bare feet made him shiver, but he was used to the sensation. On his face, pale and drawn, deep weariness was etched. He took the glass, and his thin, pale hands trembled slightly as he brought the water to his lips. The first thing after waking was always his medication. Dr. Theodor Morell, the Führer's personal physician, was his shadow, always ready with an injection or another pill. This morning was no exception. Morell, a tall, heavy-set man with gentle manners, was already waiting in the adjoining room. He entered without knocking, carrying a syringe and several small vials. Hitler, without looking up, extended his arm. The injection was quick and almost painless. Then came pills for his stomach pains, which had become his constant companion, and perhaps something for the tremor, which had grown steadily worse in recent months. He swallowed them one after another, washing them down with water. His gaze was fixed on nothing, as if he were already mentally preparing for the day ahead. After taking his medication, Linge helped the Führer shave. Hitler trusted no one but his valet with this intimate procedure, especially now that his hands trembled. Linge carefully applied shaving cream to the Führer's face, then gently, with precise movements, drew the razor across his cheeks. Hitler sat motionless, his eyes closed. He thought about the military reports he had to read, the dispatches from the front lines, and how to hold on to a slipping victory. He was tormented by thoughts of possible betrayal, of generals who, he believed, failed to grasp his brilliant plans. His morning rituals were not just mundane actions, but a way to steel his resolve, to prepare for a struggle not only against external enemies, but also against his own body, which was increasingly refusing to obey his will. Barely finished with his morning rituals, Hitler was about to have breakfast when a sharp knock on his heavy steel bedroom door shattered the bunker's usual silence. It was his adjutant, Otto Günsche, his face pale and tense. In his hand was a crumpled telegram, which he clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. Without waiting for an invitation, Günsche quickly entered, his footsteps echoing loudly in the small room. He spoke quickly and breathlessly, reporting a new, critical Allied breakthrough on the Western Front. The losses were immense, and the enemy's advance was alarmingly rapid. Hitler listened, his eyes narrowed, and the tremor in his hands intensified. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling down his temples. He gritted his teeth, barely suppressing the surge of rage that was already rising within him. The news of the breakthrough wasn't just bad. It was a blow that shattered his carefully constructed daily routine, disrupting the fragile balance he had so meticulously maintained. He reflected on his generals' renewed weakness, their incompetence threatening all his grandiose plans. His primary objective for the day became not merely holding the front line, but also suppressing any internal opposition, re-establishing complete control over the situation, and proving to everyone that his will remained unyielding. Success would mean consolidating his power, crushing the brewing conspiracy, and perhaps even turning the tide of the war. Failure, however, meant risking everything: his power, his life, the legacy he had painstakingly built over years. His body, already ravaged by illness and relentless stress, now responded to this challenge with renewed intensity. After the furious outburst that had made Günsche recoil, a tense silence descended upon the room, broken only by Hitler's labored breathing. In that moment, he realized the accustomed order was crumbling. This was no longer just another day, it was a battle for survival, where every step could be his last. Feeling a surge of irritation, Hitler left his private quarters and made his way to the conference room. His route took him through the labyrinthine concrete corridors of the Wolf's Lair. The cold, rough concrete walls, damp in spots, stretched on endlessly. Dim lighting from sparse bulbs cast a perpetual twilight, where shadows danced strangely on the faces of the few people he passed. The air hung heavy with a stale, damp smell, mingled with the acrid scent of diesel fuel from the generators. Clad in an ill-fitting military uniform, his body moved sluggishly. His shoulders were more hunched, and his shuffling gait betrayed his profound fatigue and weakness. Each step echoed through the cavernous corridors, emphasizing the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of steel doors. As he walked, he passed several SS guards, frozen in salute. Their faces were pale and tense, their eyes lowered. No one dared to meet the Führer's gaze. Further down one of the passages, he noticed two frightened secretaries. As soon as they saw him, they quickly bowed their heads, trying to make themselves invisible. A nervous cough was the only sound they made. Suddenly, from around a bend, a wounded soldier appeared, leaning on a crutch. His arm was wrapped in a dirty bandage, and his face was covered with dust and soot. Upon seeing the Führer, the soldier tried to stand straighter, but his body trembled with pain. Hitler's gaze lingered on him for a moment. His eyes, usually vacant, seemed to betray a flicker of irritation. He said nothing, his lips merely tightening. This brief, fleeting image of suffering, glimpsed within the concrete walls of his fortress, evoked no sympathy. On the contrary, it only reinforced his fanatical conviction in the necessity of fighting to the bitter end, and that weakness must be eradicated. He thought that these sacrifices were necessary for a great cause, for the future thousand-year Reich. His body continued to move heavily, and the discomfort of his military uniform felt even more pronounced. This short journey through concrete labyrinths was a metaphor for his own path, deeper and deeper into isolation, further and further from humanity, into a world where reality was distorted by his own will. A tense silence hung over the bunker's conference room. A bright lamp, hanging above the massive table, illuminated the maps spread out below, crisscrossed with colored lines. The air was thick with the scent of strong coffee, cigar smoke, and unspoken fear. Hitler took his place at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering. He played the role of the unyielding Führer, whose will was meant to crush all resistance. His gestures were sharp and confident, his voice loud and dictatorial as he issued orders to the generals standing around the table. The creak of chairs as someone cautiously shifted seemed deafening in that silence. Internally, he struggled with doubts, the fear of betrayal, and increasing physical pain. Fatigue weighed heavily on him, but he refused to show weakness. He looked at the generals' faces, trying to guess their thoughts, suspecting each of disloyalty. His hand, gripping the pencil, trembled almost imperceptibly, betraying his inner tension. He leaned over the map to examine the fine print, but even through a magnifying glass, the letters blurred before his eyes. It was a small but noticeable lapse, which for a moment exposed his weakness to those present. The general's tense gazes fixed on the map seemed to register this moment. But he quickly pulled himself together, his voice now laced with fury as he began to criticize them for their slowness and indecision. He declared that their incompetence jeopardized all his grand plans. In this theater of war, where he was the chief director, his body and mind were increasingly betraying him, but he continued to maintain his facade, knowing that any sign of weakness would cost him everything. A crucial meeting had just ended. Suddenly, in the middle of a war council, Gunsch's adjutant burst into the conference room, his face contorted with agitation. In his hand, he held an urgent dispatch, a sheet of paper that seemed to have been thrown onto the table with such force that the water carafes trembled. The Allies had made a new, critical breakthrough on the Western Front, and the situation was far worse than previously reported. It was a stab in the back, one that Hitler felt physically. The previous plan, which he had so meticulously crafted, was collapsing before his eyes. Hitler's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The tremor in his left hand intensified. His face paled, then became slick with sweat. He screamed, his voice loud and strained, echoing through the concrete walls of the bunker. He accused the generals of incompetence, cowardice, and outright betrayal. His fists clenched, and his paranoid gaze swept across the faces of those present, searching for the guilty. He nervously extinguished his cigar, the scent of burnt paper mingling with the smell of strong coffee. This new complication robbed him of any chance to rest or eat. His lunch would most likely be postponed or skipped entirely. The familiar safety and solitude of his private quarters now seemed unattainable. He felt surrounded by traitors, a feeling that only intensified his growing isolation. His breathing grew heavy and ragged, and his usually sharp attention to detail now seemed scattered, jumping from one thought to another. He understood that control was slipping away, and his usual daily routine was breaking down. The situation demanded an immediate and harsh decision, one that would determine not only his own end, but the fate of all Germany. In that moment, he felt the noose tightening, realizing he faced a choice that would decide not only his own end, but the destiny of all Germany. Following another furious outburst, Hitler, breathing heavily, retreated to his study. Dim light, casting long shadows, made the small room even gloomier. The smell of old paper and dust hung in the air, mingling with the smell of his own sweat. He paced the room, his squeaking boots echoing on the concrete floor. He leaned against the massive desk, his fingers gripping the edge of the tabletop. A portrait of Frederick the Great hung on the wall, and Hitler often paused before it, his gaze fixed on the image of the Prussian king. He sought in it validation for his own beliefs, a justification for his decisions. He was plagued by the fear of defeat, and by shame over what he considered the weakness of the German people, who, in his view, had failed to meet his expectations. He was convinced of his historical mission, believing that only he could lead Germany to greatness. The generals, who he felt didn't grasp his brilliant plans, filled him with contempt. He compared himself to great figures of history, seeing himself as a savior, the only one who could pull Germany back from the abyss. His heavy breathing broke the silence of the office. He clenched his jaw, trying to suppress a rising tremor. In this concrete bunker, surrounded by his ghosts, he made his final decision: to not give an inch, to fight to the very end, and to punish all traitors, even if it meant the complete destruction of Germany. He believed this was the only way to preserve the purity of the race and the ideals of National Socialism. In this concrete bunker, surrounded by his ghosts, he made a choice that doomed not only himself but millions, believing he was acting for a higher purpose. Evening descended upon the wolf's lair, only deepening the oppressive atmosphere. Hitler returned to his private quarters, his body exhausted, his mind consumed by paranoia. The new orders he'd issued today were already reshaping the command structure. Some generals were dismissed, while others were given new, more critical posts. Bunker security was tightened, patrols grew more frequent, and the soldiers' gazes became even more wary. These were the tangible outcomes of the day, only intensifying the sense of impending catastrophe. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, waited for him in the bedroom. Her pale face showed concern, and she tried to comfort him, but he remained distant as if oblivious to her presence. Aides, scurrying through the corridors, avoided his gaze, hurrying about their business, careful not to catch his eye. At dinner, which was brought to his quarters, Hitler barely touched his food. A half-empty bowl of vegetable soup remained on the table, while he only nervously drank water. Then, with the help of his valet, he removed his uniform, tossing it onto a chair. The smell of alcohol from the cloth he used to wipe his hands was sharp and unpleasant. His physical exhaustion was obvious. The tremor in his left hand had worsened, and his paranoid gaze was fixed on nothing. Small cracks in his persona, as the all-powerful Führer, were growing more apparent. He was no longer that unwavering leader, but a sick, lonely man surrounded by fear and betrayal. The scent of distant gunfire hung in the air, a reminder of the relentlessly approaching end. The day drew to a close, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold, leaving behind only the bitter taste of defeat and a premonition of the inevitable end. The darkness in the bedroom was almost complete. Only a faint light from the corridor filtered through the slightly open door, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The smell of stale, heavy air pressed down on his lungs. Hitler lay on the hard bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Insomnia had become his constant companion. Physical pain from stomach cramps and an unending tremor gave him no peace. He felt exhaustion seep into every cell of his body, yet his mind continued to frantically rehash the day's events. This day, filled with reports of breakthroughs and bursts of rage, was unlike so many others. It was a point of no return, a day when his paranoia found new confirmation, and decisions made behind closed doors sealed the fates of thousands. New orders, command changes, and increased security. These were all just the beginning. He felt that his power, though it seemed absolute, had become more fragile, and the loneliness he had created for himself weighed on him more heavily than ever before. A heavy sigh broke from his chest, disturbing the night's silence. He stood up, his feet feeling the cold, rough concrete floor. Walking to the table, he unrolled a map showing the front lines. In the dim light, his finger traced across the map, stopping at a point that would soon be known as Rastenburg, the site of his Wolf's Lair headquarters. He didn't know that here, very soon, an event would unfold that would forever change his life. This gesture, this touch of cold paper, connected that day to the coming years. It linked to his eventual downfall and suicide, to the birth of a monster born from defeat and fanaticism, an echo of which still resonates in our time. In that night's silence, broken only by his own breathing, he didn't know his path was already set. Every step was leading him to the very end he so desperately tried to avoid.